The morning fog hung thick over the English countryside in the spring of 1943. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel fuel as dozens of military trucks lined up outside the supply depot in Southampton. Among the uniformed soldiers moving equipment stood Thomas Hartley, a 42-year-old civilian contractor with grease under his fingernails and 20 years of hauling experience etched into the lines of his weathered face. Thomas had been driving trucks since he was 20, navigating the narrow roads of rural England, delivering everything from coal to construction materials. When the war broke out, he volunteered his services to the military, transporting supplies between depots, airfields and training camps. He was too old for combat, but his steady hands and knowledge of every back road in southern England made him invaluable to the logistics effort. If you're enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical tales. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. The depot commander, Colonel Richard Morrison, stood near the loading area, reviewing manifests with his adjutant. Morrison was a career officer, 50 years old, with a reputation for efficiency and little patience for irregularities. His grey hair was trimmed military short, and his uniform was always immaculate despite the muddy conditions of wartime England. Thomas approached the loading dock where Sergeant William Davies was coordinating a convoy destined for an airfield near Reading. Davies was a stocky man in his 30s, originally from Wales, with a practical mindset that sometimes clashed with strict military protocols. "Good morning, Sergeant," Thomas said, checking the manifest for his assigned load. "Morning, Hartley," Davies replied, not looking up from his clipboard. "You're taking the 3rd truck, standard run to Reading, then back by 1600 hours. Thomas glanced at the load distribution across the convoy's vehicles. 5 trucks were being loaded with ammunition, fuel drums, and vehicle parts. He noticed immediately that the weight was distributed unevenly, with the heavier items concentrated in the rear trucks. "Sergeant, can I make a suggestion about the loading?" Thomas asked carefully. Davies looked up, slightly annoyed. "What is it, Hartley? We're on a tight schedule." "The weight distribution," Thomas said. "If we redistribute the heavier items more evenly across all the trucks, spreading the load based on each vehicle's suspension capacity, we could improve fuel efficiency and reduce the risk of mechanical failure, especially on those muddy roads we'll be hitting past Winchester." Davies frowned. "We load according to standard military procedure, Hartley. Heavy equipment goes where it's most secure. I understand, sir. But in civilian hauling, we learned that balanced loading reduces tire wear, improves handling, and saves fuel. On long runs, it makes a significant difference." "This isn't civilian hauling," Davies said firmly. "This is military logistics. We follow regulations." Thomas nodded, knowing when to stop pushing. "Understood, Sergeant." The convoy departed at 0700 hours. Thomas drove his Bedford truck 3rd in line, following the lead vehicle through Southampton's outskirts. The roads were slick from overnight rain, and the grey sky promised more precipitation before the day ended. As they passed through the Hampshire countryside, Thomas couldn't help but notice how the rear trucks struggled on the inclines, their engines labouring under uneven weight distribution. His own truck, lighter in the back, handled better, but he could see the inefficiency of the entire operation. The countryside rolled past, green fields divided by ancient hedgerows, small villages with stone churches that had stood for centuries. The war had touched even these quiet places. Every village had its memorial to the Great War, and now new names would be added. Young men had left these farms and shops to fight, and not all would return. Thomas had grown up in this landscape, knew these roads intimately. He'd delivered goods to nearly every village within 50 miles of Southampton. He knew which bridges were narrow, which hills were steep, which turns required careful navigation. This knowledge made him valuable to the military, but it also made him see inefficiencies that others missed. Near Winchester, the second truck developed engine trouble, forcing the convoy to stop. Thomas climbed down and walked over to where the driver, a young corporal named Jenkins, stood looking frustrated under the raised hood. Jenkins couldn't have been more than 22, his face still carrying the softness of youth despite months in uniform. "Overheating," Jenkins said, his voice tight with anxiety. "We've been pushing her hard on these hills. Sergeant Davies is going to have my head if we're late." Thomas examined the truck's load. The rear was packed with ammunition crates while the front carried lighter supplies. The weight imbalance forced the rear axle to work harder, straining the entire drivetrain. Steam rose from the radiator, a clear sign of excessive engine stress. "You're carrying too much weight in the back," Thomas observed, keeping his tone neutral and educational rather than critical. "It's making the engine work twice as hard on inclines. The rear axle is taking all the strain, while the front axle is barely contributing. That's how we were told to load it," Jenkins replied defensively, looking around nervously for Sergeant Davies. "I'm not criticizing you, lad," Thomas assured him. "You followed orders. I'm just explaining what's causing the problem from a mechanical perspective." Sergeant Davies walked over, his expression tight with frustration. "What's the problem?" "Engine's overheating, sir," Jenkins reported, standing straighter. "Probably need to let it cool down for at least 30 minutes. "We don't have time for this," Davies snapped, but the anger in his voice was directed at the situation rather than the young corporal. "We're already 20 minutes behind schedule, and Captain Thornton at Reading specifically requested these supplies by noon. This is the third mechanical issue we've had this week on this route." Thomas hesitated, weighing whether to speak up again. He'd already been rebuffed once this morning, but watching preventable problems continue felt wrong. Finally, he spoke carefully. "Sergeant, if we redistributed the weight right now among all the trucks, we could prevent this from happening to the other vehicles. It would only take about 30 minutes, and we're already stopped anyway. We'd lose no additional time, and we might prevent further delays." Davies turned to him, irritation clear on his face, but also a flicker of desperation. A man responsible for convoy schedules and facing pressure from officers above him had limited options when problems multiplied. "Hartley, I appreciate your civilian experience, but we're running a military operation here. These loading procedures come from command level. They've been developed by logistics officers who understand military requirements. We'll wait for the engine to cool, then continue as planned." Thomas nodded, understanding the sergeant's position. Davies wasn't rejecting the idea because it was bad. He was rejecting it because changing established procedures on his own authority could bring down criticism from above. The military ran on following orders, not on individual initiative, especially from non-commissioned officers. They waited 45 minutes for the engine to cool sufficiently. The delay rippled through the schedule, affecting not just this convoy, but others that depended on vehicles returning to the depot for afternoon runs. Jenkins filled the radiator from jerry cans of water they carried for such emergencies, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. "Are you all right, son?" Thomas asked quietly as they worked together. "First time I've had a breakdown on a run," Jenkins admitted. "I keep thinking I did something wrong, pushed the engine too hard or missed some warning sign." "You did nothing wrong," Thomas assured him. "This is a loading issue, not a driving issue. You handled the truck well given the circumstances. Any experienced driver would have had the same problem with this weight distribution." Jenkins looked relieved, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Really?" "Really," Thomas confirmed. "In 20 years of hauling, I've seen this exact situation dozens of times. The solution isn't better driving, it's better loading. When they finally reached the airfield near Reading, they were over an hour and 10 minutes late. The officer in charge of receiving supplies, Captain Edward Thornton, was standing at the supply depot entrance with his arms crossed, clearly not pleased. "This is the third time this week a convoy has arrived late," Thornton said sharply to Davies as the trucks pulled in. The air marshal is breathing down my neck about supply delays. We have aircraft scheduled for operations that can't fly without these parts and ammunition. What happened this time? Mechanical trouble, sir, Davies reported, his voice professionally neutral. Engine overheating on truck 2. Thornton's expression suggested he'd heard this excuse before. Are these trucks being properly maintained? Yes, sir, Davies replied. They're all on regular maintenance schedules. This appears to be operational stress rather than mechanical neglect. Operational stress, Thornton repeated skeptically. Sergeant, our aircraft face operational stress every time they fly into combat. I need convoys that arrive on schedule, not excuses about stress. This affects mission readiness. Understood, sir, Davies said stiffly. We'll work on improving reliability. Thomas stood nearby, unloading crates with the other drivers, but he listened to the exchange. Thornton was a thin man in his late 30s, with the intense eyes of someone who understood that delayed supplies meant grounded aircraft and missed missions. He wasn't being unreasonable. He was dealing with the reality that logistics failures had combat consequences. The unloading took nearly 40 minutes. Ground crews moved efficiently, checking manifests, signing off on deliveries, transporting supplies to various hangars and storage areas. The airfield buzzed with activity. Spitfires and Hurricanes lined the taxiways. Mechanics worked on engines. Pilots gathered near the operations building, likely being briefed for afternoon patrols or escort missions. Thomas had delivered supplies to dozens of airfields since the war began, and each one reinforced the same truth. Everything they transported, every crate, every fuel drum, every spare part, supported the men who climbed into those aircraft and flew into danger. The work mattered. After unloading, the convoy returned to Southampton. The route took them through small towns and villages, past fields where farmers worked despite the war, past pubs where locals gathered in the evening, past churches where families prayed for sons and husbands overseas. England endured, persistent and determined. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the inefficiency he'd witnessed. That evening, after parking his truck and completing his paperwork, he sat in his small quarters at the depot, a converted storage room with a cot, a small desk, and a single window looking out over the motor pool. He pulled out a notepad and began writing down his observations, not because anyone had asked him to, but because organizing his thoughts helped clarify the problem. He sketched diagrams of trucks, marking center of gravity, weight distribution, suspension stress points. He calculated rough estimates of fuel consumption under different loading configurations. The more he analyzed it, the more obvious the solution became. But obvious solutions weren't always welcome in large organizations, especially military ones with established procedures and chain-of-command considerations. Still, he'd seen too much waste to stay silent. The question was how to approach it. Going directly to Colonel Morrison again seemed unlikely to work. The colonel had already dismissed his concerns once, but perhaps there was another path. The next morning, Thomas approached the loading operations with fresh attention. He watched how crews loaded different types of vehicles, how they interpreted the standard procedures, where they exercised discretion, and where they followed rigid protocols. He spoke casually with drivers returning from runs, asking about vehicle performance, mechanical issues, fuel consumption. A pattern emerged clearly. The trucks that performed best were often ones where experienced drivers had quietly adjusted loading procedures, using their own judgment to balance loads more effectively. But these adjustments were unofficial and inconsistent, depending on which crew loaded the vehicle and which driver was assigned to it. One afternoon in late May, Thomas was having tea at the depot canteen when Lieutenant James Pearson sat down across from him. Pearson was a young logistics officer recently assigned to Morrison's staff, only 26, but with sharp intelligence visible in his questions and observations. "You seem troubled, Hartley," Pearson observed, stirring sugar into his tea. "Just thinking about efficiency, Lieutenant," Thomas replied carefully, "or the lack of it." Pearson smiled slightly. "I've noticed you watching the loading operations pretty carefully. See something wrong?" Thomas hesitated. Years of working for others had taught him caution about criticizing established systems, especially to someone with authority. But something about Pearson's genuine interest made him take the risk. "Lieutenant, in civilian hauling, we learned that how you load a truck matters as much as what you load. Weight distribution affects everything: fuel consumption, tire wear, engine strain, handling. But the military loads everything by regulation, regardless of the specific vehicle or route conditions." Pearson leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Go on." Thomas laid out his observations in detail, explaining the relationship between load distribution, vehicle mechanics, and operational efficiency. He described specific examples he'd witnessed: the overheating engines, the excessive fuel consumption, the delayed convoys. He spoke about how civilian haulers had learned these lessons through trial and error, how experience taught what theory sometimes missed. Pearson asked intelligent questions, taking notes on a small pad he pulled from his pocket. He wanted to understand not just what Thomas observed, but why it mattered, how the physics worked, what the measurable impacts were. "This actually makes sense," Pearson said thoughtfully when Thomas finished. "I studied logistics theory at training, but they never addressed practical loading optimization. It was all about inventory management and scheduling, moving materials from point A to point B on schedule. Nobody talked about the mechanics of the actual transport, because most logistics officers never drove the trucks themselves," Thomas suggested gently. "They managed the system from desks, looking at manifests and timetables. They don't feel how a truck handles when it's badly loaded, don't see the strain on engines climbing hills with unbalanced weight." Pearson nodded slowly, processing this. "You're absolutely right, of course. There's a disconnect between planning and execution. We treat trucks as interchangeable units of transport capacity rather than individual machines with specific characteristics and optimal operating conditions." "Would you be willing to discuss this with Colonel Morrison?" Thomas asked. "He didn't seem receptive when I brought it up, but coming from an officer, it might carry more weight." Pearson considered this carefully. "Morrison is old-school military," he said. "He trusts established procedures over innovation. Change makes him uncomfortable because it introduces risk. But let me think about how to approach this. If I can gather some data to support the concept, he might be more receptive." 2 days later, Pearson requested a meeting with Colonel Morrison. Thomas wasn't present, but Pearson later described the conversation in detail when they met again at the canteen. Morrison had listened politely to Pearson's presentation of the weight distribution concept, but remained skeptical throughout. He'd raised practical objections about implementation challenges, training requirements, the risk of disrupting established procedures during a critical period of operations. "Lieutenant," Morrison had said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, and I respect that you're thinking about improvement. But we don't have time to experiment with unproven methods. We have a war to support, and our current procedures, while not perfect, are reliable and standardized across the entire logistics network." "But sir," Pearson had argued, "if the method improves efficiency by even 10%, it could save thousands of gallons of fuel and hundreds of man-hours. The potential benefit justifies some investment of time in testing. Theoretically, perhaps," Morrison had replied, his tone suggesting the discussion was ending. "But implementation would require retraining loading crews, revising written procedures, getting approval from higher command, and accepting responsibility if it doesn't work. The current system may have inefficiencies, but it's predictable. We know its limitations and work within them." Pearson had left the meeting disappointed but not defeated. He began quietly collecting data on convoy performance, mechanical failures, and fuel consumption. He enlisted Sergeant Davies, who despite his initial resistance to Thomas's suggestions had begun to see merit in the ideas after experiencing repeated convoy problems. Davies started keeping detailed logs of each convoy run, noting mechanical issues, fuel consumption, loading configurations, and arrival times. He did this unofficially at first, not wanting to attract attention that might lead to orders to stop, but after 2 weeks, the patterns in the data became undeniable. Convoys with heavier loads concentrated in the rear averaged 23% more mechanical issues than those with more balanced distributions. Fuel consumption varied by as much as 18% between similar routes depending on loading configuration. Arrival time reliability correlated strongly with load balance. Meanwhile, preparations at the depot intensified. The tempo of operations increased noticeably. More vehicles arrived, more supplies moved through, more officers visited from higher headquarters. Everyone could sense that something major was approaching. Though few knew specific details, security tightened, conversations became more guarded. Thomas noticed military police checking credentials more thoroughly, observing loading operations more carefully, asking questions about routes and schedules. The weight of coming events pressed down on everyone. Thomas continued his regular duties, driving his routes, delivering supplies, but he also continued observing and thinking about the loading problem. He spoke with other drivers whenever opportunity allowed, gathering their experiences and insights. Many had noticed similar issues, but had never thought to suggest changes to official procedures. One driver, an older man named George Craven, who'd hauled goods commercially for decades before the war, pulled Thomas aside one afternoon. "Heard you've been talking about loading procedures," Craven said quietly, "about weight distribution and such." "Just observations," Thomas replied carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Well, I hope someone listens to you," Craven said. "I've been saying the same things for months, but nobody wants to hear it from us drivers. We're just the manual labor, not the thinkers. But you're right about everything. The way they load these trucks is inefficient and hard on the vehicles. I could tell you stories about blown transmissions and ruined suspensions from poor loading practices." Thomas felt validation in this, knowing he wasn't alone in his observations. But he also felt frustrated that experienced voices went unheard simply because they came from the wrong positions in the hierarchy. In early June, everything changed. Colonel Morrison received new orders that transformed the depot's mission. He assembled his staff and explained the situation in broad terms, revealing as much as security allowed. "Gentlemen," Morrison said to his gathered officers and senior non-commissioned officers, "this depot has been designated as a primary staging area for a major operation. I cannot provide details, but you need to understand the scale. We will be moving supplies at volumes that dwarf anything we've handled before. Every vehicle must perform reliably. Every gallon of fuel matters. Every hour of delay has strategic consequences." The room was silent as the implications sank in. Thomas, standing at the back as a senior civilian contractor, felt the weight of responsibility settling over everyone present. "We have less than 3 weeks to prepare," Morrison continued. "During this period, I need maximum efficiency from every aspect of our operations. If anyone has ideas for improvement, regardless of how unconventional, I want to hear them. This is not the time for business as usual." After the briefing, Pearson approached Morrison privately. Thomas waited outside, nervous about what might happen. 20 minutes later, Pearson emerged and motioned for Thomas to follow him to a quiet corner of the depot. "I told him about your ideas and the data I've been collecting," Pearson said, keeping his voice low. "He's willing to look at it. He wants to see us both tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. Bring any documentation you have, any calculations or observations. This is our chance, Hartley." Thomas felt a surge of both hope and anxiety. Tomorrow morning, he needed to present his case convincingly to a skeptical colonel who had the power to implement change, but also the responsibility to avoid risky experiments during critical operations. That evening, Thomas worked late into the night, organizing his notes, creating clear diagrams, calculating potential savings in fuel and maintenance costs. He wrote down case studies from his civilian experience, examples of how proper loading had prevented problems or how poor loading had caused them. The next morning, Thomas and Lieutenant Pearson stood in Colonel Morrison's office. Morning light streamed through the window behind Morrison's desk, illuminating maps of southern England that covered the walls. Morrison sat reviewing Pearson's data reports, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hartley," Morrison began after several minutes of silence, "Lieutenant Pearson has presented interesting data. He claims your loading procedures could improve efficiency significantly. I remain skeptical, but I'm willing to listen. Explain your thinking." Thomas took a deep breath and began. He explained weight distribution principles, how improper loading created uneven stress on vehicle components, how this stress led to mechanical failures and reduced fuel efficiency. He used specific examples from recent convoy problems, connecting cause and effect. Morrison listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that tested Thomas's understanding. Pearson supported the presentation with data showing correlation between loading configurations and performance outcomes. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Morrison challenged every assumption, questioned every claim, demanded evidence for each assertion. Thomas answered patiently, drawing on 2 decades of experience to provide concrete examples and practical demonstrations of his points. Finally, Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Your logic is sound, and Lieutenant Pearson's data is compelling, though not conclusive, given the limited sample size. However, implementing this across all operations involves significant risk. If your method fails during the most critical operations this depot has ever undertaken, the consequences could be catastrophic." "I understand, sir," Thomas said carefully. "But with respect, the current method is already producing regular failures. We're experiencing breakdowns, excessive fuel consumption, and scheduled delays under normal operations. When we scale up to the volumes you're describing, those problems will multiply proportionally unless we address the root cause." Morrison studied Thomas for a long moment. "You're asking me to stake my career and possibly the success of a major operation on the word of a civilian truck driver and some preliminary data gathered by a junior officer." "No, sir," Thomas replied firmly. "I'm asking you to test a proven method on a small scale before making any large commitment. Let us demonstrate the improvements under controlled conditions. If the results don't support the claims, you've lost nothing but a few days. If they do support the claims, you'll have a more efficient logistics operation at exactly the time you need it most." Pearson spoke up. "Sir, we could run parallel operations, continue standard procedures on most convoys, while testing the new method on a select few. Compare performance directly. The data will speak for itself." Morrison considered this compromise carefully. "1 week," he said finally. "You'll coordinate 6 test convoys using Hartley's methods. I'll assign comparable convoys using standard procedures as controls. At the end of the week, we'll review comprehensive performance data, including fuel consumption, mechanical reliability, arrival times, and crew feedback. If the improvements are significant and consistent, we'll discuss broader implementation. If not, we return to standard procedures immediately and permanently." "Thank you, sir," both Thomas and Pearson said. "Don't thank me yet," Morrison warned. "If this fails, if it causes delays or problems during implementation, the responsibility falls entirely on both of you." "Understood?" "Understood, sir," they responded together. The testing week began on June 10th. Thomas worked intensively with Pearson and Davies to design the test protocol. They selected vehicles carefully, ensuring comparability between test and control groups. They chose routes that represented typical operational conditions, mixing highway runs and difficult terrain, various weather scenarios, different cargo types and weights. Thomas personally supervised loading for each test convoy, teaching crews the new procedures hands-on. He explained the principles behind each placement decision, helping crews understand not just what to do, but why it mattered. Place the heaviest items low and forward, he instructed one crew. This lowers the center of gravity and puts weight on the front axle for better steering control. Medium weight items go in the middle section, distributed evenly side to side for lateral balance. Lighter cargo fills the rear and upper spaces. The crews were skeptical initially, accustomed to their established routines, but Thomas's patient explanations and obvious expertise gradually won most of them over. He never criticized their previous methods, instead framing the new approach as additional knowledge that would make their jobs easier and more successful. The first test convoy departed with Thomas driving the lead truck. He wanted to personally observe vehicle performance and demonstrate confidence in the method. Behind him followed 5 trucks loaded according to his specifications, driven by experienced corporals who'd been briefed on what to watch for. The route to an ammunition depot near Oxford took them through varied terrain. Rolling hills tested engine performance. Narrow village streets tested handling and control. Sections of muddy road tested traction and stability. The trucks performed beautifully. Engine temperatures stayed consistent, even on long inclines. Fuel consumption tracked noticeably below normal rates. When they hit difficult road conditions, the balanced weight distribution provided superior traction and control. The drivers reported that their trucks felt more stable and responsive throughout the journey. They arrived 43 minutes ahead of schedule, every vehicle performing without issues. The receiving officer, a logistics major named Williams, commented on the excellent condition of the trucks despite the challenging route. "Your vehicles look like they've had an easy run," Williams observed to Thomas as they unloaded. "But I know this route. It's one of our more difficult supply runs." "Good loading makes a big difference," Thomas replied simply. Over the following 6 days, 5 more test convoys completed their assigned runs. The results were remarkably consistent. Compared to control convoys using standard loading procedures on comparable routes, the test convoys showed measurable improvements across every metric. Mechanical failures down 38%. Fuel consumption improved by 14%. On-time arrival rates, 97% versus 71% for controls. Driver feedback, universally positive about improved vehicle handling and reduced stress on equipment. Lieutenant Pearson compiled comprehensive reports documenting the results. He included statistical analysis showing the improvements were significant beyond random variation. He provided detailed breakdowns by vehicle type, route difficulty, cargo weight, and weather conditions. Every analysis supported the same conclusion. Optimized weight distribution produced substantial performance improvements. On June 17th, Morrison called Thomas, Pearson, and Davies to his office. He'd spent the morning reviewing the test data, his analytical mind working through the implications. "Gentlemen," Morrison began without preamble, "your method works. The data clearly demonstrates improved performance across multiple independent measures. The consistency of results across different conditions suggests this isn't coincidence or temporary variation. This represents a fundamental improvement in operational efficiency." He paused, and Thomas saw something in the colonel's expression he hadn't seen before: respect tinged with regret. "I was wrong to dismiss this initially," Morrison continued. "I let my attachment to established procedures override my willingness to consider alternatives. That was poor judgment on my part, and it could have cost us dearly during critical operations. You three showed persistence and initiative in proving the value of this method, despite my initial resistance. That deserves recognition." Thomas felt a wave of relief and validation wash over him. "I'm authorizing immediate implementation across all depot operations," Morrison said. "Lieutenant Pearson, you'll develop comprehensive training materials and standardized protocols. Include detailed diagrams for each vehicle type we operate. Sergeant Davies, you'll coordinate crew training and oversee implementation on the loading docks. Mr. Hartley, you'll serve as senior technical advisor throughout the implementation process. Any crew or officer questions about proper procedures get referred to you." "Yes, sir," all three responded. Morrison stood and extended his hand to Thomas. "Thank you, Hartley. Your contribution could make a real difference in the success of the operation we're supporting. That operation begins in less than 3 weeks. Your timing couldn't have been better." The handshake felt significant to Thomas, a gesture of respect between professionals rather than the formal acknowledgement between superior and subordinate. In that moment, Morrison was recognizing Thomas's expertise and contribution as equals in service to a greater cause. The next 17 days were the most intense of Thomas's life. The depot transformed into a hub of controlled chaos as D-Day preparations reached their climax. Supplies poured through in staggering volumes. Convoys departed constantly, moving ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, vehicle parts, and countless other items essential to the invasion force. The new loading procedures were implemented across all operations, despite the frantic pace. Thomas barely slept, moving between loading docks at all hours, teaching crews, inspecting vehicles, riding along on critical convoys. Every truck that departed represented a commitment to the soldiers who would need those supplies in France. Training sessions ran continuously. Thomas stood at loading docks explaining principles, demonstrating techniques, answering questions. Some crews adapted quickly, others needed more time and patience. But all of them recognized the stakes and gave their full effort to learning the new methods. Pearson created detailed loading charts for every vehicle type in the depot's inventory. Each chart showed optimal placements for different cargo categories, with measurements and specifications that made implementation straightforward. He wrote procedural manuals that could guide any loader through the process, step by step. Davies coordinated the organized chaos with impressive skill. He scheduled training sessions around operational demands, assigned experienced crews to mentor newer ones, and personally inspected critical loads to ensure standards were maintained. The improvements became evident immediately. Mechanical reliability increased dramatically. The maintenance crews reported fewer emergency repairs, less component stress, longer intervals between required services. Fuel consumption dropped measurably, saving precious petrol that could be allocated to other needs. Most importantly, the depot's ability to maintain its aggressive schedule improved significantly. On June 6th, the invasion began. The depot's operations intensified further as resupply efforts ramped up to maximum capacity. Convoys ran around the clock, every available vehicle in constant use. The loading procedures proved their worth under the most demanding conditions possible. Thomas was loading a truck at 0300 hours on June 7th when he heard aircraft overhead returning from missions over France. He paused to look up at the dark sky, thinking about the men in those planes, the soldiers on the beaches, all depending on the supply chain that started here at this depot. Everything mattered. Every properly loaded truck meant more reliable delivery of essential supplies. Every gallon of fuel saved meant another mission could be flown. Every hour gained through efficient operations meant soldiers received what they needed sooner. The work continued without pause through June and into July. The Allied foothold in France expanded, and the supply demands grew proportionately. The depot handled volumes that would have seemed impossible months earlier, but the improved procedures helped make it manageable. On June 23rd, a staff car arrived carrying Brigadier General Harold Whitmore, Senior Logistics Officer for Southern Command. Morrison met him formally, clearly anxious about this high-level inspection. Whitmore spent 3 hours reviewing operations, examining performance data, interviewing personnel at all levels. Finally, Whitmore requested to meet Thomas. They stood in Morrison's office, the general studying Thomas with experienced eyes that assessed people quickly and accurately. "Mr. Hartley," Whitmore said directly, "your loading procedures have attracted considerable attention at command headquarters. Colonel Morrison's efficiency reports showed improvements that frankly seemed too good to be believable. Statistical anomalies of that magnitude usually indicate either measurement errors or data manipulation. But I've spent this morning verifying the numbers personally, and they're genuine. You've made a significant contribution to our operational capabilities." "Thank you, sir," Thomas replied, uncomfortable with high-level praise. "I'm authorizing immediate implementation of your procedures across all logistics operations in Southern Command," Whitmore continued. "That encompasses over 40 depots and thousands of vehicles spread across the entire region. This will require a massive coordinated training effort. Lieutenant Pearson will handle overall coordination and documentation. Colonel Morrison will provide administrative support and operational oversight. And you, Mr. Hartley, will train the trainers who'll spread this knowledge throughout the command." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the scope. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm only one person. Training that many people across that many locations seems beyond what's possible in any reasonable time frame." "You'll have all the support you need," Whitmore assured him. "We'll assign additional personnel to work with you. Your role will be training senior logistics personnel who can then implement the program at their respective depots. We're targeting full implementation within 6 weeks. It's ambitious, but the demonstrated benefits justify the effort." Over the following months, Thomas became an unlikely figure in British military logistics. He travelled across southern England, visiting depot after depot, conducting training sessions for officers and crews, adapting procedures for different vehicle types and operational conditions. He worked with mechanics to better understand vehicle specifications. He collaborated with route planners to factor loading considerations into convoy scheduling. He refined and improved his methods based on feedback from dozens of different operational contexts. The impact rippled throughout the logistics network. Fuel consumption across Southern Command dropped by an estimated 11% overall. Mechanical failure rates decreased by 31%. The cumulative effect of these improvements on operational capability was substantial, contributing measurably to the sustained success of supply operations supporting the campaign in France. In August, Thomas received an official commendation from the War Office. The ceremony was small, held at the Southampton depot with Morrison, Pearson, Davies, and other officers present. A staff officer from London read the official citation, recognizing Thomas's innovative contribution to military logistics and the war effort. "Mr. Thomas Hartley," the citation read, "for exceptional service to His Majesty's forces through development and implementation of optimized loading procedures that significantly improved operational efficiency across military logistics operations. His contribution exemplifies how practical expertise, creatively applied, can enhance military effectiveness." After the ceremony, Morrison requested a private word. They stood outside watching the depot's continuing operations, trucks coming and going in the eternal rhythm of logistics. "I owe you an apology, Hartley," Morrison said quietly. "When you first brought this idea to me back in May, I dismissed it out of hand. I let my attachment to established procedures, my skepticism about civilian input, and my resistance to change override common sense and good judgment. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. "You had valid reasons to be cautious, sir," Thomas replied generously. "Military operations require reliability and standardization. You were trying to protect those principles, which are important." "Perhaps," Morrison conceded, "but I should have been more open-minded, should have listened more carefully to someone with genuine expertise, regardless of their position or background. You've taught me an important lesson about where good ideas can originate, about the value of practical experience over theoretical knowledge, about listening to voices outside the normal hierarchy." "The military is learning that lesson across many areas," Thomas observed. "This war has forced everyone to adapt, to accept new ideas more quickly than peacetime bureaucracy would ever allow." "True enough," Morrison agreed, "but that doesn't excuse my initial closed-mindedness. You persisted despite my dismissal, found another path to prove your ideas, and ultimately contributed significantly to our operational success. That took courage and determination." They stood in companionable silence, watching the fruits of their combined efforts. Young men loaded trucks with practiced efficiency, applying principles that Thomas had developed and Morrison had ultimately embraced. The knowledge flowed through the organization, improving everything it touched. The war continued for nearly another year. Thomas remained with the logistics operation, his role now officially recognized as senior technical advisor. His loading procedures became standard practice, not just in British logistics, but eventually in American operations as well, as joint coordination led to sharing of effective practices. In April of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final desperate weeks, Thomas stood at the Southampton depot watching convoys prepare for what everyone knew would be the last major supply efforts. The fighting had moved deep into Germany. Victory was approaching, though at terrible cost. Lieutenant Pearson, now Captain Pearson with additional medals on his chest, joined Thomas at the loading dock. The younger man had grown considerably in capability and confidence over the past 2 years. "Thinking about what comes next?" Pearson asked, echoing a conversation they'd had before. Thomas nodded slowly. "Back to civilian life eventually. Back to the roads I've known all my life, delivering commercial goods instead of military supplies. It'll seem quiet after all this intensity. You contributed as much to winning this war as many soldiers," Pearson said seriously. "You found a way to serve that used your specific talents and experience. You probably saved thousands of gallons of fuel, prevented countless mechanical breakdowns, and helped supplies reach the front more reliably throughout the entire campaign. Those aren't small contributions." "I just did what I knew how to do," Thomas replied modestly. "That's exactly what makes it meaningful," Pearson insisted. "You had knowledge and skills that the military desperately needed, but didn't know it needed. You recognized a problem, understood the solution, and persisted until you could implement that solution despite institutional resistance. That's a special kind of service." Thomas considered this perspective. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps his contribution, though different from soldiers fighting in combat, had been valuable in its own way. Every war needed people filling countless roles, some dramatic and others mundane, all essential to the collective effort. The depot continued operating through the summer of 1945, its mission shifting from combat support to occupation logistics and eventually demobilization. Thomas remained involved, helping adapt the loading procedures for changing post-war requirements. In September, with Germany defeated and Japan surrendering after the atomic bombs, Thomas's contract concluded. Morrison hosted a farewell gathering with the personnel Thomas had worked most closely with over the past 2 years. "Mr. Hartley," Morrison said in his brief remarks, "you came to this depot as a civilian contractor hired to drive trucks. You leave, having transformed how the British Army moves supplies. You proved that valuable innovation can come from unexpected sources, that practical experience has enormous value, even in technical military operations, and that organizations benefit from listening to unconventional voices. We're all better for having worked with you, and the Army is more effective because of your contribution. The gathered personnel applauded. Thomas felt emotion rising in his chest, recognizing that these men had become more than colleagues over the intense months they'd worked together. They'd become something like brothers in service, united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Thomas returned to civilian life, resuming his pre-war work driving commercial trucks along familiar English roads. But he carried with him knowledge that his contribution had mattered, that his voice had been heard, that his expertise had made tangible difference during a critical period of history. The loading procedures he developed continued in use for decades after the war, incorporated into military logistics training throughout NATO forces. Few people remembered the civilian truck driver who originated the concepts, but the efficiency principles endured as part of standard practice. Thomas rarely spoke about his wartime service in detail. When people asked what he'd done during the war, he simply said he'd driven trucks for the Army. The full story, the initial resistance he faced, the data collection and testing, the eventual vindication and implementation at scale, those details remained private. He didn't need public recognition or widespread credit. The personal satisfaction of having served well was sufficient. But sometimes, driving along routes he'd traveled hundreds of times over his long career, Thomas would remember those intense months in 1943 and 44. He'd think about the skepticism he'd faced and overcome, about Morrison's eventual apology and strong support, about Pearson's open-minded curiosity and analytical rigor, about Davies's practical assistance and willingness to collect data despite initial doubts, about the loading crews who'd embraced new methods despite their resistance to change. He'd remember the satisfaction of seeing his ideas proven through rigorous testing, implemented at organizational scale, and contributing measurably to operational success. He'd think about how his 20 years of civilian hauling experience had found unexpected and valuable application in military logistics during the war. Most of all, he'd remember the broader lesson his experience illustrated. That expertise exists in unexpected places and unconventional forms. That innovation often comes from people who see problems from different angles than established authorities. That persistence in advocating for good ideas can eventually overcome institutional resistance and bureaucratic inertia. That large organizations, even military ones with strong hierarchical cultures, can change and adapt when presented with compelling evidence and clear benefits. Thomas Hartley had been a truck driver before the war, during the war, and after the war. That simple identity described his occupation, but not the fullness of his contribution. During those critical months when Britain and its allies prepared for and executed the liberation of Europe, he'd been something more. An innovator who improved how armies functioned. An expert whose knowledge found crucial application at exactly the right moment. A persistent voice that insisted on being heard until someone finally listened with open mind and willingness to test unconventional ideas. That was his legacy. Not fame or widespread recognition or historical prominence, but the quiet knowledge that he'd contributed meaningfully when circumstances allowed, that he'd seen a problem clearly, understood the solution through hard-won experience, and persisted until he could implement that solution at scale despite initial rejection. For Thomas Hartley, that was more than enough. He'd served according to his abilities, contributed according to his knowledge, and made genuine difference in outcome through his particular expertise. The roads of England had carried him through a lifetime of service, civilian and military, ordinary and extraordinary. He travelled them with deep satisfaction, knowing he'd done his part when history called, in exactly the way his unique experience had prepared him to contribute. The trucks still rolled, carrying goods and supplies across Britain's rebuilding landscape. The principles Thomas had developed still guided how they were loaded, still improved their efficiency and reliability, still saved fuel and reduced mechanical stress. His innovation had become invisible, absorbed into standard practice, no longer recognized as innovation at all. That invisibility was perhaps the highest compliment. The best innovations become so obviously correct, so thoroughly integrated into normal operations, that people forget they were ever innovations at all. They become simply the right way to do things, the natural and obvious approach that nobody questions anymore. Thomas Hartley had changed how armies moved supplies. He'd done it quietly, persistently, through expertise rather than authority, through evidence rather than rank. And in doing so, he'd proven something important about how progress happens, about where good ideas come from, about the value of listening to voices that speak from experience rather than position. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.